First I'd actually a shout out to Kat Cesek. You're very much missed, Kat, if you're watching the live stream, someone who's really been, I think, a pioneer in some of the 360 video side as well. So I approach this topic from a slightly different angle. I am a human rights activist who works with citizens who create human rights media. I'm someone who's constantly trying to think about the question of how do we engage people to impact amid a flood of media. So I'm coming from that perspective as I think of where we stand in VR. I'm also tremendously interested in immersive media and have been for a number of years. I'm not a VR maker, and I recognize that just to start off. So some of the people that I work with are, oops, someone's, yeah, we have to do it on this side. Can I run this in presenter view, or is that too much for pain?
Fine.
Great, thank you. Great, so these are some of the people I work with. I typically work with frontline activists, these types of individuals. And most of the time, the key challenge they're facing is how do we engage people, how do we compel them to action, and what is meaningful action? And I'm going to start from my assumption. I'm going to make some critiques here. I'm going to start from the assumption that as VR creators, many of us have that aspiration to action that is present, and that we're not aspiring to the sort of National Enquirer of VR, where we're looking for attention, but we're not looking for impact. And I wanted to start with a picture that I first came across when reading the work of Stanley Cohen. And I want to talk about, the first topic I want to talk about is the question of denial. Why is it that people don't want to watch our stories and listen to our stories? We're in a strange phase in VR because everyone wants to watch and listen to our stories. Everyone is desperate to be in the experimental phase, to be in that room outside. For most media on tough topics, people are desperate not to watch our media. And Stanley Cohen uses the example of Bruegel's picture here, The Fall of Icarus, and he cites Auden's poem. So again, taking a historical precedent here. About suffering, they were never wrong. The old masters, how well they understood its human position, how it takes place when someone else is eating or opening a window or walking dully along. I.e., there's always suffering out there, but our own issues are always more important. So how do we move people into that space? Philip Larkin, he's very famous for another quote. I won't quote that one, but he does say this, which is, yours is the harder course I can see. On the other hand, mine is happening to me. So with those in mind, how do we think about challenging denial? And how do the affordances of VR help us there? So Stanley Cohen, again, who's written a lot of the most important work in this area, talks about three kinds of denial. Literal denial, it didn't happen. Interpretive denial, that wasn't ethnic cleansing, that was population exchange. If we look back at the Balkan Wars of the 1990s. And implicatory denial, that's got nothing to do with me. And we can deny that on a moral ground. We can deny that on the ground we can't emotionally respond to. We can deny it on the grounds of action. When we look at what motivates people to act, there's a lot of research on bystander, acknowledgement, and intervention. And these are the circumstances when it's less likely. When responsibility is diffused, we don't know if someone else is going to do something. When people are unable to identify with the victim, when people cannot conceive of an effective intervention, and when distant bystanders lack the texture of rich personal experience and direct risk. This gets interesting, because you think about VR, we have that opportunity with some of this VR we're creating to address some of this. The embodiment, the place illusion, the sense of agency we can have. So there are opportunities here to use VR to address some of this bystander risk, this bystander intervention challenge. The second thing I want to note is around attention and VR. And again, I'm looking ahead, and I somewhat echo Janet. I've spent time at Davos. I know what it's like. I know that next year they won't be looking at VR. They'll be looking at something else. Every media form has its moment of explosion when the novelty drives it forward, and then we know what happens next. I've seen it with many forms of human rights media, from citizen journalism to live streaming, now to VR. We're competing in a climate of images where the image on the right is the image that breaks through, that people are looking at. The image on the left was a version, I'm not showing the original version, of the rare image that did break through. I see thousands of images every year of all the human rights stories that no one paid attention to, all the refugees who died on the shores of Europe, on the shores of Libya. So we have this question of how do we engage people beyond denial, and I think VR has an opportunity there. The second risk I want to address is one that I grapple with in activism. And it's something that Lily Chulliaraki, who writes a lot about spectatorship and suffering, talks about, which is how do we go from part of the culture of activism now, which is about self-expressive activism. Wow, I watched something, it made me feel bad, I did something, I tweeted about it, to something that is witnessing in solidarity. I'm using the slightly ironic here of the Barbie Savior Instagram account. For those who haven't seen that, a real gem of exploring exoticization and poverty tourism. And again, poverty tourism is the other area we have to look at. Poverty tourism and exoticization is about getting close enough that we get the feeling of it, but we have the comfort to be able to move away. And there's value to that ability to be exposed, but we have to be aware of the flip side of it. So this isn't a puppet show. When we're watching people, it's not about our emotion, it's about the experience of others when we're looking at the type of VR that at least has been a significant part of the experience here, which is this idea of creating empathy. Let me question the question of whether empathy is really what we're looking for. And again, I'm speaking from the perspective of someone who's trying to think about moving to action. There's a fair amount of research that looks at empathy and thinks about the consequences, and we looked at some of it before. What worries me about empathy is it doesn't move people to action. So I would ask you, and I'm going to put this out as a question, how do we think about solidarity and compassion rather than empathy? And I'd be glad to talk about that in the conversation, what it means to think about those. Compassion is seeing something, stepping back, doing something. Solidarity is standing beside someone, not walking in their shoes. And I think those are equally important possibilities of VR that we haven't yet fully explored. And I think we could explore them to tremendously powerful effect. One more challenge, then I'm going to talk about an area of VR that I'm very excited about to finish. This is a challenge that is true across all human rights media. How do we communicate structural violence? But I think it's particularly true in the case of VR, which is we have these intense, and at the moment they're 4 or 5 minute, experiences of a reality. And Fox put it very well earlier. He said, you can walk in someone's shoes, but you cannot understand their own history or their cultural context. And so if we take an example like the work that many of my colleagues do in Cambodia, I can drop you into the middle of an intense moment of a forced eviction. That doesn't tell you why Hun Sen has been in power for 30 years. You have to understand that. And I would love to think how we use VR to communicate structural issues. And again, I put this out as an invitation as something where I would love to collaborate as well with people who are thinking about that challenge. And it raises the question for me, and this tails into the next slide, of what is the Instagram or Snapchat of VR that gives us the day-to-day exposure of someone's life? That's what I really look forward to, is how do I feel what it's like to be alongside someone in Cambodia facing forced eviction? James Agee put it very well. I can't remember the quote in my head, but he talks about the wearying hours of work of the cotton worker that he documented when he was doing his photographic projects. How do you understand those wearying hours, those wearying days in VR? Then there'll be something very powerful. Let me talk about something I'm super excited about. This is a quote from Mark Zuckerberg when he launched the Oculus Rift, talking about this incredible possibility of standing next to people who are facing injustice, experiencing it live, being able to stand with them. Actually, I'm joking about the second part. He didn't say that. But it's interesting, when I read his quote, I thought he's kind of describing, stand by the baseball court, basketball court, stand in a classroom. Why not stand on the front lines of a protest? As we think about Oculus, we think about immersive experience, we think about live immersive experience. So I want to talk about the area that I'm most excited about. It hasn't really come up here, and I understand the division between 360 video and live and constructed virtual reality. What is interesting, and I was watching the NAB announcement of 360 live video on YouTube about 2 weeks ago, is you can increasingly do 360 live. And what is interesting for me there is we address one of the questions we've been grappling with here, which is whose agency are we talking about? We've been talking a lot about increasing the agency of the people in a VR experience. We're neglecting the agency of the people we have filmed, the people who are the subjects of the VR experience. And I think there's something very interesting in 360 Live about how we bring the two together. And I want to talk about it in the context of presence to co-presence. So we're talking about presence, this sense of being somewhere. I want to talk about co-presence, the sense of being somewhere together with other people in this case, together with the people who are in the 360 live in reality. So the people who are the subjects of the video. And I want to just point out an inspiration that drives the work that I've been doing on this, which is from Brazil in 2013. There was this very interesting moment. There's someone who's live streaming, not 360. It was on one of the earlier live streaming platforms. The policeman says to the man, "Watch the search." The man, who is a media ninja, it was the name of one of the media activists there, says, "I will watch the search, and there are 5,000 people watching it." And it was very interesting, because what happened is those people then called the police station, exerted pressure. They were interacting with the live experience in real time. Now imagine if that was 360, how immersed those people would be and what they could potentially do. So we've been working, I'm going to just mention a project that we work on at Witness called Mobilize Us, which is looking about that idea of co-presence to action. So when you can have immersive live video, what can you do with that? So some of the things we've been looking at are, how do you bring people into iconic spaces and turn that into mobilization, like the Capitol of the North Carolina State Building? How do you turn it into pressure on site? So we built something that enabled people to show how many people were watching live to prevent violence. It's called Witness With Us. We looked at how you could bring it behind closed doors. You might only let 2 people into a room meeting. This is the Ukrainian Central Bank. It's my favorite door picture, because it is the most imposing door ever built. But how do you bring people behind those closed doors of power and say, we can be represented here, we can interact in support of people? How do we do rapid reaction? How do we make that happen? And there's a really key idea that I think is important here, which is I was talking about our denial and our lack of caring. The people at the other end also kind of believe that most of the time. So this was someone who was a sex worker in Macedonia, talking to a colleague of mine or someone we'd trained, and she said the well-fed never believe the hungry. And it really stuck with me, because there is a genuine belief often by the people who are our subjects of our media making that we don't actually care. And so I think there's something tremendously powerful about co-presence when we can do that in a way that people think we are walking beside them and taking action in sites of struggle and sharing their joy when we succeed. Saul Alinsky talks about the power of joy. That's equally important for us to share in a co-present experience. And of course, as we think about haptic technologies, which is touched a little bit here, I'm more interested in the haptic technology on the activist on the front line feeling we care than us feeling his experience, if that makes sense. I think that's when we start to think about solidarity as a really powerful emotion.
Thank you.